Welcome to the Healthcare IT Today CIO podcast. I'm John Lynn, the founder and chief editor at Healthcare IT Today, and I'm excited to bring you the most practical healthcare CIO insights and perspectives. We know your job is challenging, and we want to help you be more successful. And our guest today is a longtime friend of Healthcare IT Today. He's Drex DeFord. He's a former CIO and executive healthcare strategist at Crowdstrike. Welcome, Drex.
Hey, thanks. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to kind of do a little ripped from the headlines episode of the CIO podcast. But before we dive into the topics for today, tell us a little bit about your experience as CIO and also now at Crowdstrike.
Sure. I'm a longtime healthcare CIO. I refer to myself as a recovering CIO. I've been in the business for 30 plus years now. 20 of that in the U.S. Air Force, and then became the CIO at Scripps and Seattle Children's and Steward, and did an independent consulting stint for about 6 years with vendors and VC firms and PE firms and health systems, obviously. And then in March of this year, became the executive healthcare strategist at Crowdstrike. So I help Crowdstrike I'm kind of a utility player. I help them with everything from product development to connecting to customers, to helping them understand how healthcare works and helping make our products and services a better fit for healthcare.
Awesome. Not to put you too much on the spot here, but you've been a recovering CIO for a while. Are you ever going to come out of recovery, or are you kind of happy with recovery?
It's I get this question regularly, and recruiters still call, and I would never say never, right?
Okay.
But I mean, I'm having so much fun now doing what I'm doing at Crowdstrike. I've always sort of thought about this world that we live in as, where do you get the longest lever to make the most difference in the most organizations at the same time? And for me, Crowdstrike has just been a dream job. And I really feel like, especially with everything that's happening right now, I can make the most difference for healthcare here. And so, like I said, I'd never say never, but I think I'm going to be a recovering CIO for the rest of my life.
Yeah. Well, there's a spot at Intermountain, No, I'm just kidding. No, so I mean, to your point, you really are well positioned because security has become such an important topic for CIOs. And as I said, kind of ripped from the headlines, one of the biggest ones is the Log4j vulnerability that's just impacting so much of technology. Do you think we'll see something like the Log4j vulnerability again? And what are some of maybe the lessons that CIOs need to take from this vulnerability?
Yeah. Man, I mean, I don't know what to say, except I hope not. I'm sure that, for the folks that are watching, they probably already have the background and insight on Log4j and what it is and why it's a challenge.
If they don't, it's a problem.
It's a problem. It's a problem if you've not heard about this and you don't kind of understand it. But I mean, the kind of the lessons that I kind of see from this as I talk to CIOs and CISOs around the country is that lots of organizations were in the middle of their change freeze this time of year, which means patching anything that you're going to do, updates to, the logging system, the, Log4j application itself. Any of those things are going to require a bunch of approvals and a ton of coordination with a bunch of people who probably aren't in the office right now. So we've got to work on that process. I know we want to freeze. I know we all want time off and we all want vacation. But man, it seems like that's when the bad stuff happens, especially when it comes to cybersecurity. The other lesson would be that, you may not know that you're even using, Log4j. Yeah. If you write code, chances are really good. Hopefully, chances are good that that you're using that open source code and that it's part of something that you've created. But in healthcare, we often use COTS products, or we use software as a service product. And in those cases, you'll clearly have to rely on your vendor. They have to either come into your network and patch or upgrade their systems, or if you're using as a service, you hope that's what's happening over in their data center so that they're protecting you and protecting your data. But the bottom line is kind of everything's connected to everything else. And as a CIO and CISO, you're still held responsible for all of those things, which means to me, more transparency with leadership, more transparency with the board. And there's this ongoing, really important conversation about risk and how you're bearing it and how you're managing it and all of those things. It's just critically important now that you're as transparent as possible.
Yeah, and I think what you said right there near the end was what stands out to me is how interconnected everything we do is. I saw someone tweet a picture that said powered by Java, which before nobody would have even noticed, thought about, like, oh, great, Java's running that. I think it was a med device or something like that. Yeah. You're like, wait, now it's like a sign of potentially at risk for ransomware. So, it's like the underlying components of what we're using in healthcare, do we even understand? And the answer is probably not, right?
I think, this is what's happened over the last few weeks, is that I think at first everyone looked outside of their DMZ at all of the stuff that was facing the internet and were really concerned about that. And that was absolutely like phase one for sure. Yeah. That's where to focus your energy. But as they got into it, they started to realize that this open source code, it seems like it may be easier to figure out what it's not on than what it's on, what it's on. And then it turns out to be, IoT devices, IOMT devices. There are so many things that use it. So the further we've gone in and the more digging that organizations have done, the more stuff they've found that they have to, go and patch. And a lot of this is just, it's awareness. It's not something you would think about or not something you would necessarily look for, given, all the stuff that you have on your network, the hundreds of applications and the hundreds of thousands of servers in some places. It's a complicated business. Yeah,
that's interesting. Like, no HIPAA risk assessment would have shown this to be a potential vulnerability that people needed to worry about.
Yeah, I think it started kind of like in the gamer community, right? Where the gamers were kind of trying to thrash each other. And, that sort of revelation of you send a line of code to this logging system, and then it lets you, do a call out to a server that's your server that you can inject malicious code. I think there's still a lot of blogging and a lot of writing around, like, how did this even happen? How did this make it through production? All that kind of stuff. But it's not the kind of thing that would have shown up in an audit. I mean, some of these things, some of these kind of 0-day exploits, until they happen, you don't know that there's a weakness or a vulnerability.
Yeah, I heard a great story. I think it was Epic, Judy Faulkner at Epic, received some document that said, you need to ensure that your software will not have any bugs. And she read that and she's like, that's impossible. Right? And so she crossed it out and added the word, the not. Right. My software will have bugs, and then signed it and sent it back. Because that's the challenge, right? When you have millions of lines of codes, the numbers are just clear. So that's interesting. How about the other big news, the Kronos ransomware? What are some of the lessons from that, right? And for those that, essentially Kronos has a ransomware incident, and it's been down for, I think at this recording, a couple of weeks, Mm-hmm. So, what's the lessons from that experience?
Yeah, well, a lot of these are sort of similar lessons, right? Everything's connected to everything else. And so even though you're getting something as a service, it doesn't mean that you should then skip past the business continuity planning, especially for things like employee pay. Now, hopefully most organizations are just, if they can't figure it out and they're not able to document time, they're at least doing something like just give them the same paycheck that they had last time, and then we'll sort of, clear it all up later. But having those plans in place and not panicking turns out to be one of the most important things I think you can do as a business clinical research leader or a technologist. Business continuity, disaster recovery, incident response, plan, do those regular exercises. What do we do when something like this happens? Use lots of different scenarios. We rely on technology so much now, John, that it's like, I mean, we have seen it over and over and over again in the last couple of years that when a system, even just one system in an organization goes down, it can massively impact the employees, but as important, patients and families and safe care. So it's a big deal. The other thing I would say is this is just another example of like, expect that if you're a CIO or a CISO, the next scheduled holiday is probably one of the best times to be attacked. And, just, I guess, kind of plan for it, expect that that's probably when it's going to happen. And the other thing I would say is ask for help. There are really good cybersecurity companies out there that can help you through all this kind of prep work and planning and incident response planning and all those kinds of things. They can cover you 24/7 and have your back when things get unpredictable. And a lot of them have, kind of seen it all and experienced it all and have great perspective when things like this happen. So ask for help, get help.
Yeah. Do you think this is going to cause some organizations to kind of pull back on the cloud? I mean, many had even gone to a kind of a cloud first approach, if you will, for many of their applications. Do you think this is going to kind of make them second guess it, or are we still all in on cloud?
Yeah, I mean, I hope not. I think that, it's easy to say, generally speaking, you are probably better off working with a cloud provider than you are trying to keep the stuff in your own data center and, manage it and protect it yourself. Now, I mean, if you want to put the resources into it and, do it, keep it all internally, then, certainly that can be a way to go. But realistically, I think as we look to the future, there's going to be fewer and fewer good products that are going to be available for you to deploy in your own data center. They're only going to be available as a service. And so, I think folks can try to pull back and try to sort of resist, but I think it's going to happen. We're going to continue to move to the cloud, and healthcare's, in some cases going kicking and screaming, but they're definitely going.
Yeah. So shifting gears a little, we've had a lot of conversations over the years, but one of the things that I always remember you talking about is the idea of good governance and the need for good governance to really be able to manage limited resources. And, interestingly, I think it applies to security, right? We can't spend everything. We can't cover everything, right? But I think it applies everywhere. The EHR, communications, whatever, right? Whatever project a CIO might be working on. In fact, they're working on all of those projects.
Yeah,
right?
at the same time.
Exactly. So, what's your best tip for a CIO about how to, implement, deploy, manage good governance?
Yeah, man, there's a bunch of them, but I'll kind of narrow it down to just a few here. One of this goes back to transparency, right? Be transparent. These are all the projects that are on the list. This is how the process is working, that we are working with everyone to make the decisions about what's at the top of the list. There are no smoky backroom deals. Everything's above board. When people can see everything, they can not like it, but they can at least understand how it's being done. So transparency would be number one.
I was going to say, do you fear that people are going to come and that was a bad decision because you were transparent, or is it just the other way around? It's like worse because then their imagination is worse than the reality.
Yeah, I think that if you do it in a smoky backroom kind of environment, people, their imagination will run wild, right? They will come up with the worst version of the scenario that's happening. So if you're transparent, they can criticize it, but at least they can see how it works, which kind of gets to the second piece, which I think is clinical business and research leaders kind of have to lead and own the process. And they have to go back. It's not just sitting at the table and making decisions about what gets prioritized and what doesn't get prioritized. But it's also a really important part of their job to go back to their constituents and have that conversation about why those decisions were made. This requires them putting on the big organization hat and not necessarily always being just a hardcore advocate for their part of the business, their part of the organization, but it really requires them to go back and kind of have that two-way conversation, right?
Yeah.
Another one is kind of deciding. It's really important to decide what you're going to do, but it's as important, it maybe is even more important that you're really clear on what you're not going to do, because there are a lot of things that go into this process, right? Here's the list of 500 projects that an organization needs to have done. And a lot of them will be no-brainers, but compared to the amount of resources that you have available to do them, some of them aren't going to get done for lots of good reasons, even though they should be done. And so again, clinical business research leaders have to, wherever they draw the line, they have to be really clear about, we're not having any little backdoor, black operations to try to figure out how we're going to get our thing without it being approved. So what's not being done, that's really important, and maybe as important as the stuff that you decide you will do. And the last one is just, as we've seen the last year or the last couple of years with COVID, flexibility. I always referred to my team. We talked about it as semper gumby, always flexible, not really Latin, but kind of Latin.
Yeah, I like that.
That really sort of applied to the idea that you only have so many resources and you're going to do projects every year, but you have to reserve some capacity for the unpredictable or the thing that has not been predicted. And sometimes that's things like an acquisition that you just happen to be able to do, but you had not planned for, but the sky opened up and you were able to sort of buy another hospital or buy a clinic, or it could be 100 other things, including COVID. And so you have to reserve that capacity and build that plan as much as you can to be as flexible as possible to take advantage of the things that are good for you or react to things that are maybe bad and happening to you.
I think that's what makes governance so hard is, one, it's ever evolving. And then two, to your point, that saying no is really hard in healthcare because what you're saying no to could have some benefit. So it's not like you're saying, no, that's a terrible idea, it's going to fall flat. You're usually saying no to things that could benefit, maybe even 1,000 patients, but you're saying no to those 1,000 patients because you can help 10,000. Right? I mean, that's a hard thing to do.
It is. It's a super hard thing to do. And while I think we're better at doing those things, my brain works in analogies. And so I think we're better at doing those things in our personal life. Okay, well, I'm going to make the mortgage payment this year instead of, going on vacation to France.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think we're better at it, but I don't know. We also carry a lot of credit card debt in the United States. So maybe we're not that great at it. I think logically, at least thinking about it for ourselves, we understand it. When we get to the corporate environment, when we get to our organization's environment, it just seems like there should be more resources. And so this thing that helps 1,000 patients and seems like a no-brainer to me in the interventional radiology department turns out to be we can't do it. There aren't enough resources to do it in this next year or in this cycle. And again, I think another part of this too is not saying no, never, but just saying, no, not right now. And, I need for you to, as an organization leader, when I'm talking to those departments, I need for you guys to just bear with me here. There are other things you can do. Let's look at process improvement and how you bring patients through the system. Make those improvements. And as you make those improvements, it will become even more clear what it is that you need from a technology perspective to really supercharge that process. So there's always things that you can do. It's not always about buying another piece of technology or another application. And if you don't get the application, if you don't get the tech, do the other things. The more you do those other things, the better the definition will become around what you really need. And that can mean better pricing. It can mean, you're not buying as much stuff in one fell swoop. It means that the process reinvention doesn't have to happen as part of the IT project, which is often what slows down and causes cost overruns in IT projects, is that we don't think about the people and process part of the technology implementation, or we do, but we don't necessarily figure it into the project plan. Again, another really important reason why clinical business and research leaders have to own those projects too. They have to be responsible for the other part of that work, not just the tech work. CIOs and their teams will hopefully run that as efficiently as possible, but it's all the other stuff that you can get hung up on.
Yeah. Well, and I think vendors don't make it any easier because they're in those clinical leaders here. Oh, we don't need IT. We can do it easily for you. It's you know they don't need any work. And I mean the lies they
Yeah.
tell when it's like, well, no, it's got to pass the security review at a minimum, right? Let alone
Yeah.
integrations and other things. So
I mean, I think especially as we've moved to the cloud, right? There's been a lot
yeah,
more of that
exactly.
kind of conversation with vendors about it hardly takes any IT time. All you have to ask them for are these minimum amount of integrations. And you can buy it on your credit card. And this is where you get into trouble, right? The
You
no
don't even need
becomes
the
really
PO. Yeah.
important. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. Interesting. So, what's the most valuable thing that you ever did as a CIO?
Wow. Let's see. Most
You were CIO a lot, so
no,
there's
I
probably a
know,
lot
I
of
know.
things, right?
So, I was lucky enough as an Air Force officer, actually as an enlisted guy, I was able to live in Japan for 3.5 years. And I really got into, at the time, Toyota production system and learning about Toyota and
Okay.
how all that stuff worked. And it's something that I carried with me throughout my life. And a big part of that was this idea of the Japanese call it going to Gemba, or going to where the work is happening, as a way to really understand why systems, and not computer systems, but people process technology systems, might be broken or challenged or need to be upgraded or fixed, or waste taken out. And so the going to Gemba part, I think, is probably one of the most valuable things I ever did. Spending time in the clinics and the ICUs and the emergency department, and working the overnight shift, and seeing the the maintenance crew. And there's so many things you can learn. It's amazing how much stuff gets filtered when you're an exec.
Yeah.
That you get the rose-colored glasses view of the world ultimately. And if you don't go to Gemba and you don't see it firsthand, you definitely miss out. And that includes your own IT staff too. Like, go to the frontline IT staff, spend time in the help desks, go out with your desktop techs, see how the world works from their perspective, and make sure you put programs in place that lets them go to Gemba too, and really see how, as the storage person, their job impacts the ICU. It'll change them forever, and they'll really understand why they're such a critical component of better, faster, cheaper, safer, easier to access healthcare for patients and families.
Love that. Great advice. So, as you look at your career, what's the best advice you were ever given that that you could maybe share with other people who are maybe just starting their career, or halfway through?
Yeah, the best advice was probably I got a really terrible piece of advice early on.
Oh yeah, I want to hear the terrible.
Yeah, the
actually,
terrible piece of advice.
Let's hear that.
I was a young lieutenant. I had been an enlisted guy before I was commissioned as an officer, and during my enlisted time, I'd worked in IT. Now, this would have been this would have been like the late '80s, so I was using ARPANET before we had the internet, and I was a beta tester for the Mosaic browser and things like that. But I remember having a hospital administrator, when I first was commissioned as an officer, tell me, you got to get out of this computer business. It's not going to go anywhere. So that was the most terrible advice I ever got. It actually really motivated me to kind of continue to figure out this IT stuff in healthcare and how we can make healthcare better. But the best advice I got probably was at the other end of my career, as I retired from the Air Force and went to Scripps Health, and I had a leader there tell me, don't try to hide from who you are. I know you're making this transition into the civilian world, but all of that military experience, like, don't be afraid to talk about it or relate it to things that we're doing here. And that, for me, has kind of continued to evolve into this idea of embrace your weirdo, embrace the thing that makes you, all those things that make you unique, because I see a lot of people spend a lot of time trying to suppress those things that make them unique so that they fit in and they're more normal. But I think that weirdo stuff actually might be your superpower, right?
Oh.
That might be the thing that actually makes you more valuable in your organization. Now, there's limits to this. Don't get me wrong. But
you can alienate, right?
Right. You can definitely go too far. But I think that, all of us have unique backgrounds and unique experiences and just unique interests, things that we're really into that we shouldn't spend all of our energy trying to hide from it. We should just embrace it. And if we do, I really do think it's kind of like it's a rocket, it can make you better. So embrace your weirdo. That's the advice.
Nice. I like it. This came up in previous episodes where, Ed Marks comes in just full storyteller, passion, energy, inspiration. And then someone like Will Weeder, he comes in with more of a pragmatic, operational, and just starkly different, right? Or even Naomi from Dana-Farber, right?
Yeah.
She comes with something totally different than those two gentlemen, right? And you look at it and they're like, yeah, that's the key. I mean, I think is what you said, which is understand your strengths, right?
Right.
Because Will's versus Naomi's versus Ed's are just so different, but all three of them have been successful because they embraced what was special to them. So that's
here's the other thing too, John, is really interesting is that in all of those cases, what you find are people who really understand themselves and are, aware of what they're good at, but they're also aware of their weaknesses and the things that they're not good at, or things that they can be good at, but that's not who they are and they don't want to do it. And so they build a team of weirdos who kind of cover all of the areas, right? And they understand that just because they have teammates who are really good at other things, that's not a threat to them. That actually makes them better. And so asking for help is a sign of strength, right? They bring all of these weirdos together and build amazing teams that do great work. So yeah, embrace your own weirdo, embrace all the other weirdos too. Maybe that's the actual advice.
I love it. And maybe it's not even that we're weirdos,
Maybe it is
a strength, to your point, right?
For sure.
To quote the famous philosopher, a singer, he says the same is lame, right? That's
I like it.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks so much, Drex. I appreciate you taking the time to hop on this episode. And thanks everyone for watching. If you want to find all the rest of the episodes of the CIO podcast, you can check them out at healthcareittoday.com. Thanks, Drex.
Always my pleasure.